والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد. So we begin inshallah with our journey in our reflection on healthy relationships. And in this session, this is the second session, we're dealing with a topic which is extremely complicated. And from the looks of it, we're going to have to break this up into more than one session, just because from experience, from what is going on in the ummah, I'm not going to say a specific community or specific group of people, in general, what's going on in the ummah, and from personal experience in dealing with people, not only Muslims, but not Muslims alike, Muslim and non-Muslim alike. And so in this, we should find some sutra or sitr, some, cover, so people don't begin to think that this is going on in this particular place and it's not going on in that particular place. Unfortunately, that's how we deal with issues at times. So we want to talk about the issue from the angle of it's happening in the world overall. It's happening in different cultures and in different communities overall. And what is that? That's the issue of conflict and argumentation in our relationships. And that is to varying degrees, right? That takes place at varying levels. It's not all at the same level. Some people have an understanding of how it is that they're going to work out the conflicts in their relationship, and they have developed that understanding over time. And other people are frankly lost as to how to work through their conflicts. And so, as the author said, some conflicts can bring us to a good place and some can bring us to a bad place. But I want to remind us really fast before we go into that issue that what we're trying to do here is we're trying to look at some of the things that are normally not openly discussed in our communities. Some of these ideas it takes involving professionals to come into our relationship to help us, or some of us, we refer to YouTube or talks, or we hear from people. So what we want to do is change that culture of how it is that we understand relationships on the psychological level, meaning on what's going on within ourselves. And what happens, that's a lot of, most of the time, of what goes unspoken, what it is that we are experiencing and what it is that we're going through. A lot of times we're trying to figure out if our decision is the right decision, if how we're understanding is the right way of understanding. We're going through a lot on a personal level when it comes to that issue. And so a lot of times we're left on our own. So that's first, that we want to begin to say that we have to learn how to deal with relationships. We have to learn how to deal with ourselves in the context of our relationships. The other thing is that we have to begin to reaffirm principles that are Islamic, as well as principles that deal with the human reality and the human condition, what it means to be a human being. And so I want to remind us that the Quran teaches us, and I've mentioned this before, I want to mention it again, that it's from the signs of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and خَلَقَ لَكُم مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ أَزْوَاجًا. So our understanding from the beginning with regard to the relationship between the male and the female is not that the male and the female are intrinsically, meaning within themselves, set to be at war with one another. Now there's something that we need to bring up with that, which is brought up in the book with regard to why is it that the relationships that we see around us, why is it that they end with husband and wife being at war with one another? Intrinsically, the way that we're made is to be compatible to one another. Not everybody's going to be compatible, but the general orientation that we have as male and female is to be compatible with one another. And that's why setting the foundation of the relationship firmly, establishing the relationship on a strong basis, firmly from the beginning, is important for its growth and its development. We have to acknowledge that changes and shifts have taken place in how we understand a lot of things in the world today. We also have to be clear that as Muslims, we have guidance from the Quran and from the prophetic example. And that guidance allows us to speak to our reality into the time period that we're living in. So in regard to marriage, and in regard to how we understand male-female dynamics, we have to be very clear, cognizant, understanding, aware of what is it that Islam is teaching us as far as principles, because those principles speak to our nature as human beings, and they also are what we say we commit to. I hope that's a very subtle understanding. Meaning Allah is the one that created us. Meaning Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is the one that guides us. So Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala is guiding us to that which is in our benefit. So we need to slow down a little bit to root ourselves, to ground ourselves, to orient ourselves into understanding ourselves in light of wahi, of revelation itself. Because we've lost our way in that regard of understanding ourselves in light of what it is that we say we believe in. It's not just philosophy. We're saying that the built-in instruction that we believe in, which is the Quran, which is the manual to understanding reality as we experience it as human beings on this earth, is the Quran itself. In other words, Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala created us and is teaching us about our existence, our life, how to live. We have the task of trying to understand, there's no doubt. But first, we have to be clear that we have to regroup, reorient ourselves on the Quranic understanding of ourselves and life overall. Then we have to realize that society itself has many human communities. All of those communities are not in line with any religion. All of them are not in line with Islam. So we have a number of different ideas that are operating in the world about relationships. Then we have to understand our culture is work. The culture that we have by birth and the culture that we have in the society that we live in. So there's ideas with regard to men and women, males and females, husband and wife relationships, which are not necessarily the ideas that we hold on to with regard to our deen. Because that's part of the issue. How we're understanding ourselves is not always in light of Islam. So I'll give you an example. I brought it up before, and then we have to move on. This issue that human beings, male and female, are compatible to one another. In other words, they're made so that they come together in a marital bond. لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا وَجَعَلَ بَيْنَكُمْ مَوَدَّةً وَرَحْمَةً. That's an important reality. That the ta'leel, the rationale here in our creation itself, is so that we come to live together, and it's supposed to be in tranquility for the most part. It's supposed to be where my heart can rest in the relationship. And that has a whole series of discussion what healthy relationships mean in that light, but we're not going to go into that right now. But it's not only that, it's not only for my heart to be resting in the relationship, to be tranquil, to be at peace in the relationship, to be okay, safe in the relationship, but there should be love and mercy in that relationship. And I keep emphasizing this point because we have forgotten that. And we're beginning to understand our relationships with each other in light of what everyone in the dunya is saying, except what Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is saying with regard to how it is that we should understand ourselves in the family. And it's not just one ayah of the Quran, there's a series of ayah of the Quran, and then there's another point that comes up, and then definitely we're going to move into the book. There's a hadith that has two narrations to it. إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِيَتِمَّ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ or صالح الأخلاق. That part of nubuwwah or prophethood or the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam coming is to refine, to perfect our character. That which is good of it, to increase the goodness so that we become whole human beings. We will never become whole human beings on any sort of program if that program is devoid, empty, disconnected from revelation itself. Because the task of revelation, the goal, or one of the goals of the Prophet coming is to help us to become whole, to perfect our character. And that's before the whole idea, that we say that marriage is half of our deen. If we don't know how to be whole as individuals, we won't be whole in a relationship. It becomes half of our deen when we go into that contract. We're not deficient because we're not married. There's many ulama that never married. There's many people that never married. It's that we believe in marriage, so we emphasize it. Some of our understandings there are problematic as well, of what it means to be single and so on and so forth. That's where a lot of the confusion comes in at. But the ayah of the Quran, it reads that from among the signs of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala is that He created for you spouses from among yourselves, that you may find rest in them. And He has put between you affection and mercy, between you two, affection and mercy. Right? And then the hadith reads that indeed I was sent for the perfection of character. And so character is necessary in our relationships. Character is fundamental to who we are as Muslims and in our deen. So when that character is deficient on the individual level, it's definitely the case that is going to be deficient in the marital relationship. And the marital relationship can't exist in a healthy, harmonious manner. It can't exist in a way where there's tranquility if we're not bringing the character of Islam, which brings us to salam. It brings us to peace and safety. When we say assalamu alaikum, it's not routine. When we say assalamu alaikum, that salam, that peace, that tranquility comes from iman. That tranquility and that peace has to transfer from our condition in our hearts to each other. That's the first bond that we have with one another, regardless as Muslims. It's not easy because we have disconnected in many ways from our deen and from ourselves as human beings. So the author goes into talking about the issue of resolving and preventing conflicts and arguments, and extends what we learned last time about lending an ear, the whole issue of active listening, where we are focused on understanding the other, not that we are trying to be understood, but we're focusing on trying to understand the other. Because when each person is aiming to be understood solely, it's definitely going to be the case that someone is not going to be understood. If we're in a relationship in which we're communicating and I am trying to be understood solely, and I'm not trying to understand the other, I'm talking about both parties here should have this clear understanding in the relationship that firstly, in this case, how do we begin to have healthy communication? I need to understand where you're coming from. Then I can communicate with you on terms that are clear, in a manner which I have a basis, a common ground to dialogue with you on. I know where you're coming from. Then I can share stuff about myself. It's easier to have some understanding of where you're coming from. But for whatever reason, what begins to happen is we think that if we're not understood first, there's a problem. And that becomes the issue, that we're thinking about only ourselves. And that's where our understanding of relationships has changed. That each individual is only thinking about themselves in the relationship. The concept of us is not there. My rights, what I want, what I don't have. The concept of us is not there. When the concept of us is there, and the concept of me being in a solid relationship with myself and Allah, when that's firm, it's easier. يعني التبادل أسهل بكثير. I can exchange, is much easier to exchange with you. I'm firm with my relationship with Allah. I'm not by myself. We said Muslim marriage is not just husband, wife, and 2.5 kids and the cats. And for some Muslim, the dogs. You know what I'm saying? It is my relationship with my grandparents, with my parents, with my uncles and my aunts and my cousins and my siblings. It doesn't mean that we don't have our space, but the concept of family in Islam is bigger than the concept of family in the society that we live in which it is now governed by the idea of individualism. Even the children in today's family, and unfortunately, even in the Muslim family today, which is not really the Muslim family as we understand it in the context of the Quran, is Muslims in a family relationship. But what has happened is that everyone is striving for what they want to take out of the relationship that we call family. So the idea first is we have to understand ourselves as Muslims, right? We have to understand what's going on, how these changes occur, because the concept of family has definitely changed. That doesn't mean that everything is traditional, because everything traditional wasn't necessarily everything Islamic. But there was a concept of traditional family that has broken. And there's goodness in that concept of family that existed, but there's also problems in that concept of family that existed. And we're in a transition period where the concept of family has been impacted and remade and rebuilt and deconstructed. And we're in a situation where we're trying to figure out how we ground ourselves. So this book, the skeleton in this chapter of this book, which is chapter 2, I put it like this. Why couples fight is a general idea of why all couples fight. So we have an understanding of why is it that there's problems in marriages. Then how do we begin to identify what causes the fight on a personal level, right, that we're going through? And then how is it that we can look at prevention or containing or de-escalating the fight? And the issue of classifying fights. There's some fights that are good, and there's some fights or beneficial, and some fights that are harmful, definitely. And of course, you can say some fights, they're mixed with benefit and harm, but we don't have to get into that technicality. So conflict and argument, how do we deal with it? First, we have to understand that some conflicts and arguments, they can lead to our growth if it is operating under principles that are not destructive and not harmful and not taking away from the dignity of the other person. And if that conflict and that arguing is guided by understanding the other person but working through issues, as conflict is part of life. You understand what I'm saying? That's why even in Islam, the whole concept of war is understood as part of human reality, but what is restricted because it causes destruction. Some conflicts are like war. That's why we have to be careful how we take out the sort of conflict in a marriage, in a relationship. This even with dealing with our children. That's why we say some conflicts and some arguments They don't lead to our growth, but they lead to our destruction. They lead to oppression. They lead to violence and so on and so forth, verbal and physical violence. And that's not justified Islamically. That has its own discussion on the issue of darb, or the issue of striking, or the issue of using physical discipline in relationships, not just husband and wife, but with children. That's for another time and another session. But to say Islam does not allow destruction at that level in the relationship, that's the position that we take. The other issue is that sometimes conflict and argument leads to divorce. So then the question becomes, on what terms do we divorce? Destruction again and oppression? If we already had domestic violence and everything else that's going on in the relationship, are we going to carry that into the divorce? Yeah, come on now. So then the issue becomes, if we decide to divorce, on what terms do we divorce? So that's the general idea. Conflict, argument, where is it going? Where do we want it to go? Do we want growth out of this, or do we want al-intisar wa tadmir, for someone to be victorious and champion and be stronger over the other and prove their point, and the internal destruction of relationships and self and emotion and wealth and everything that comes with it? The conflict may resolve issues that we have in the relationship that can't be resolved by divorce. And that's fine. Divorce is allowable in Islam. But how we divorce, Islam deals with that and teaches us, that it should be done in a way of honor and dignity. So why are some reasons why there is fights in relationships overall? I added a few things that are not present in the book. We're not going to go into all of the details right now. But just so that you get the overall framework and you have it in your mind. In other words, people, what are the scenarios, right, that lead to fights? Just like we say, this career, if you become a doctor in this type of medicine, then you will have this type of economic lifestyle. Or just like we say, for instance, if you become a teacher in the New Jersey public school system, well, the New Jersey public school system, it has retirement and it has these opportunities. When you work, you have a Christmas vacation off, you have the summers off, but you may have to work above 40 hours per week. You understand that when you go into that scenario, there's certain things that take place. You understand that when you go into that scenario, there's certain things that take place. So here, we want to understand what are the scenarios in which we're seeing that people are having conflict and problems in their relationship, so that we can understand how we deal with those scenarios. Because these scenarios that are brought up, you're not going to get around these scenarios. First of all, one of the major things that we see in society, we're not just talking about the Muslim community, in society overall, is that one of the number one causes of, in today's time, in a capitalist society, understand what type of world we live in, what type of society that we live in. We said we live in a world, in this, at least in this part of the world, where individualism is what's dominant in all relationships. We also have to understand that we live in a time period, in a part of the world where money is what dominates capital. So that has an impact on how we live. Money is needed for mostly everything, where that was not the case in the past. You didn't have to necessarily in the past pay for property taxes. In the past, you know, even in some countries, onions were free. You know what I'm saying? You may have bought vegetables and this, that, and onions were free. You know, you may not have had to pay for water. And you still have some places like that. But here, the basic essentials of life, food, clothing, shelter, they all require money. To be in a masjid requires money. To have lights in the masjid, to have sound, to have internet requires to pray. In other words, as a jama'ah, we need a space to pray, requires money. To get a hospital care, it requires money. We know that. That's clear. But we don't realize the impact that it has on our minds. To the point that now the cell phone has brought the marketplace, Amazon Prime or whatever it may be, you know what I'm saying, into your home, where you're making transactions at 12 o'clock at night. In the past, there was a limit in this country. There were the blue laws. You were not allowed to sell alcohol. Stores were closed on Sunday. Stores were closed about 5 or 6 o'clock. The whole New York City phenomenon, the city that never sleeps, and you go find a pizzeria open or a pharmacy open 24 hours. Oh, that's new realities. So that shows how much the marketplace has had an impact on it. So people, one of the number one things that we see is that there's fights about money, finances. There's fights, about money and finances. There's fights about the whole issue of children. There's fights about the children, how they should be raised. Should we send them to Islamic school, not send them to Islamic school? How much time do I spend with them? Why don't you take them out? Why are they always with me? Why are you always dropping them off at your mom's? You said you were going to be with the children, but you dropped them off to your sister. I don't like for them to be over your sister's house because she has a way of raising her children. How to raise the children? Do I have time to spend on homework? I just came in after, a 10-hour shift, 11-hour shift. I'm exhausted. You deal with them. You get up, go make the milk. You change the pamper now. So that becomes the issue of how to deal with the children. And it becomes more problematic when we get into the issue of, for instance, different religions. If a Muslim man, and even in today's time, a Muslim woman, they opt to marry, I'm not going to get into the halalness and haramness of that, because here we're talking about reality of where some people are at and the advice that they need, how they need to become aware of their situation. The arguments that come from the whole issue of different religions. For those who have not gotten married and are thinking about getting married, you have to understand that that becomes a point of conflict. It's not raised here as an issue by itself, but it should be. One of the reasons why people argue is the different types of religiosity. That's between just Muslims. Now it can become a point of argument between a Muslim and a non-Muslim that got married. How do I raise my children? I want them to be Catholic. No, my children are going to be Muslim. That type of argument or what takes place. So you have to pick your spouses in a way that are going to align with your values, people, and are going to facilitate that process of marriage and raising children together. If it's already difficult to be in a relationship with a Muslim who practices in a certain way, and I may not practice at the same level, or I may practice more, whatever. We even have in our community, I'm saying this from what is reality. It's not about what I support or what I don't support. We have Sunnis and Shia that marry each other. And so then the issue becomes, how do they work that out? We have Christians and Muslims that marry each other. How do they work that out? So we have to have that understanding that raising the children becomes complicated, and especially when it comes even to the issue of religion and expenses and all of that, our quality time and their care. And it becomes even more complicated, people, when there is a disability in the family. That's something that we also don't talk about. You have to know that when you have a child and that child has a disability, that it will weigh on the family very heavily. Or you have a child that has a specific condition, they can't sit still. Or the way that they, are dealing with issues that they may have experienced. A child that may have been abused, that child will have a disruptive schedule. Or a child is affected by husband and wife arguing on a regular basis. that child begins to listen to that and feel that and see that. And whether they're 2 years old or whether they're 5 years old, they begin to feel something is not right and they become very disruptive. And that leads to more arguments because that child is not disciplined, not controlled. Over, you know how it is that husband and wife are dealing with one another. Time, spending time with each other. It's a major issue. You're always busy. You're always at work. What are you doing at work? You know what I'm saying? You're never home. You're always at the shop. You're always just focused on school. So the reality of this situation is that when you're constructing a marriage, you have to know that your lifestyle, how you spend your time. If you don't deal with that in a way which prioritizes the marriage, or you have a clear understanding that, look, I'm going to be extremely busy because we're trying to reach this particular goal, or I'm trying to reach a specific goal and it's going to benefit us in this. You have to be clear. Graduate school breaks relationships because of this issue. People don't understand that. They think, oh, the person is moving on. This is no, graduate school by yourself will destroy a relationship if you're not aware of the fact that what graduate school demands is a great degree of attention being taken away from the family and put into the program of study. There's also the issue of spending time, and people have separate interests and everything that comes along with it. I'm just hitting on the niqat, the different points. That's why I said this is going to take a series of, talks. The issue also of priorities. That leads to, what are your priorities? You're always going out with your friends, but you don't take care of the kids. And that leads to a position where I don't feel like I'm the center of the marriage anymore. You're out with your friends, you're out with your family. What about me? There are times when partners may start to think that they are no longer a priority in the lives of their spouses. There are no flowers anymore, no unexpected hugs, no kisses, no demand for intimacy, nothing. As a matter of fact, I'm not even considered. I may get sick and you may not even know. Oh, glad you're well. You may not even, no consideration. It's not only priorities as far as giving the person importance and giving the person time and so on and so forth. It's also what kind of priorities do you have together in the relationship? And how do those priorities that you have together in the relationship match with your priorities at what you have as an individual? We have to realize we're shaped by individualism. So we have to learn how to deal with individualism. And we have to learn that it's more than just me. But we also have to learn that it's not going to just be that I disappear and everything is just the family and I don't have any personal goals in my life. That's not how we live. It's violent to ourselves to neglect ourselves in that way. And matter of fact, if we don't have some space, we can't come to the relationship to be the best that we can be. I may need some time to clear my head. I may need to decompress. I just was at the clinic. I was at the hospital and someone died, or I was counseling and someone committed suicide. I was working 15 hours for 5 days straight. I'm exhausted. We may need some time to decompress. We may have a lot of stuff going on that has to do with work. So we may need that space to rest up. I may need to take care of myself. I may need to go to the gym so I'm stronger and I have more energy and I can sleep. And even the same thing with the issue of my physical health and appearance. Why should I go into society with the Gucci bag and the, I show my hair or the nice hijab and this and that, and then for my husband, I don't, show any of my beauty for my husband or take care of myself. Same thing for the husband. You look a mess. You have a gut. You don't take care of yourself. That type of thing. Some people may get offended by that, but that's the age that we live in. Everybody is impressed by the selfies and by the muscular person and by the beauty queen. And unfortunately, some of that is good and some of it is not. But the point being is that taking care of yourself, that's the point that I'm mentioning, in the right way for yourself, so that when you come into that relationship, you're bringing some battery charge to it, spiritually at the same time. If your relationship with yourself and the law sucks, there's no other way to put it other than that. Spiritually, that's damaging. You can't get around. I can't get around from my relationship with Allah. Allah is the master of the universe, the one that knows our intentions in our hearts, the one that has designated for us a certain set of responsibilities in this world. If I'm violating my relationship with Allah, definitely it's going to have an impact on my relationship with other human beings, my relationship with myself. So I am not going to be the best spiritually and emotionally and mentally if I'm in the haram. I have to learn that my peace with myself is not just taking care of myself physically and mentally, but it's also taking care of myself spiritually, is also connecting with my Rabb, the one that created me and sustains me and guides me and sent the prophets to show me how to live. When I'm disconnected with that source of reality, and I'm in league and in line with shaitan and the shayateen, meaning that I'm in league or doing things that are harmful to myself and to others and to my dignity and to my honor, that's what the haram is, then definitely what I bring to the relationship is going to be an issue. So the priorities, what are my priorities? That is a source of fighting. The issue of the past, what was done in the past. The author brings up the past arguments, past situations, what was done in the past. She brings up the issue of sex. I prefer not to use the term sex. Not because I'm scared to use the term sex, but because I feel that the term sex doesn't encompass everything that a relationship necessitates or needs. We talk about intimacy. Intimacy is a better term because intimacy could be that like we talked about in the last session, that I am with my partner and my partner is actively listening to me. I'm connected at that level. That's a sense of intimacy, a sense of closeness. My partner shares beautiful words with me, or my partner reminds me of Allah, and it brings me, with goodness, and it brings me close to my partner and close to myself, and I just love him or her for that reason. You understand what I'm saying? So intimacy can't not just be defined as sex. As a matter of fact, this is problematic because when it's just at the level of sex by itself, on the physical level, people, that doesn't mean that we are connected at other levels. So there's a lot of loneliness that people report from that. So here we disagree with the author, but the point is nice because sometimes our community also needs to know that, yes, along with the Habibi is the rights and the responsibilities of husband and wife at that level. Because that also is an issue where people are not open with that. They don't realize that that's part of the relationship and they kind of live in another world, or there may be issues there for whatever reason. It could be trauma. It could be misunderstanding. It could also be that we're speaking to each other in very bad ways. And it just puts us in the point that, yes, we're in a relationship. We're not thinking about divorce. Get away from me. I don't want to deal with you. That mindset. So that leads intimacy, verbal intimacy, emotional intimacy, physical intimacy. It leads to fights. And if it doesn't lead to fights openly, it's underlying as a cause to why this fight. Again, listen to what I'm saying. I'm saying intimacy at a higher level. Don't get stuck on just the issue of sex, because some people approach sex for the concept of intimacy, connection, and love. And when it's not there spiritually, when it's not there emotionally, when it's not there intellectually, it's not going to be there physically. You understand what I'm saying? And that goes in degrees. It's not an absolute, right? And so also the big issue is how we deal with the household. She puts chores. I prefer to say responsibilities. Who's cooking? Who's not cooking? Who can come into the kitchen? Who can't come into the kitchen? You understand what I'm saying? Who takes out the trash? Who didn't take out the trash? Who mops? Who doesn't mop? Why am I always cleaning? You're not cleaning. You're a slob. The responsibilities of the household. I'm more clean than you, or I'm more cleanly than you. All that. And that can be an indication what goes on as far as the household responsibilities of something deeper. I may have checked out. I may be depressed because I lost my job, or I may be depressed because of what goes on at work, and I don't talk about it with anyone. I hold it in. You understand what I'm saying? And I'm disengaged at home. Or I may be overwhelmed because I'm taking care of all the children and I'm visiting my sick parents and I'm doing 1,000 different things. And at the end of the day, I'm falling short on uh, contributing to the household in that way. Or I may be the person that is like, I don't do that. You understand what I'm saying? I don't do that. That's not my role. And that's where role conflicts come in at. That's where there's debates with regard to the whole issue of household responsibilities. I put something that she didn't mention, two more things that she didn't mention, that where fights come from, how I feel in the relationship. How am I being treated in the relationship? How I feel about how I'm being treated in the relationship. That leads to a fight. It leads to many fights. It leads to underlying issues. And again, remember, we live in a society of individualism. So a lot of us, we're egocentric. It's about me. We haven't reached to that level where it's about us. So sometimes people, and this is a hard one to talk about, sometimes what we're experiencing, we may feel aloneness. I'm trying to come up with another term other than just saying loneliness. We may feel alone in the relationship, but it may not necessarily have anything to do with our spouse. It may have to do with the fact that we are not in healthy communities. We're not in healthy family relationships. We're not in healthy friendships. That's why for us as Muslims, we have a different reality. The masjid is the center of our lives. And from there comes friendship and community and family and everything that's the ideal condition. There's no doubt about that. But in some communities some masajid do better than others in that regard. We have to be very real about that point. How I feel about the relationship, especially in the case of like loneliness or aloneness, my spouse may not be able to break me out of that if I really don't have a good connection with people overall, because I may over depend on my spouse for everything. So that's just one example, but also how I'm talked to in the relationship, or how intimacy is expressed to me. That may be the issue. The other issue is in-laws and friends. That's a big one. The issue of in-laws and friends as a source of conflict in our relationships with one another. In the Muslim community, this is a big one, and it varies from culture to culture because there's expectations that come along with culture. We can't just say we're going to throw it out. And we also have problems with the fact that we living in this society that we live in, we're not aware of what happens. انفصام الشخصي. We begin to develop split personalities. So we begin to be individualistic, egoistic, but at the same time, we have this culture that we belong to, and this community that we belong to, and this tribe that we belong to. And so we have a conflict about freedom and commitment to the family. Freedom, my commitment. That I've seen that in many cultures. I've seen that in big African American families. I've seen that in Bosnian families. I've seen it in Arab families or Eastern European, because they're including the Turks and others. I've seen that in the Desi community. We have that in the Muslim community, which most of the counseling is not going to help with us because it doesn't include us. It's counseling which is directed to the European American cultural model, in which it's not really considering that the family is much more than just husband and wife and 2.5 children and the dog or the cats. And so for us, the concept of family Islamically and culturally is not that. Even the whole issue of friendship and the role of friends. But that could be a conflict when it's not a healthy set of relationships, or when there's issues that come into that, or when there's al-urf al-fasid, corrupt customs and all of that come into play, or there's issues that come up, or fights that come up, or bad advice that's given. Friends and I hate to use the term extended family, but for simplicity's sake, extended family, better said in-laws, they could be a source of issues for us in our relationships. and it could be a source of the problems in our relationship, and it could be the determinant. It could determine how we deal with that situation, whether our relationship will continue or not continue. Some in-laws, some parents feel as though that they have the right to divorce the children or call for a divorce regardless. You understand what I'm saying? Some children feel as though that they don't have to show any respect. I'm talking about, we can be adults but still children to our parents. We're always children, and not have any respect to our parents. Some in-laws feel as though the daughter-in-law is just a servant. You have all these types of cultural understandings. And so then how do you deal with that as a Muslim that's becoming conscious of what it means to be a Muslim, and understanding what it is that Islam obligates, and understanding that at times what Islam is calling us to may be a little different than where the culture is at. That doesn't mean you throw all of the culture at, but so then how do you begin to work? That can be a source of conflict. Because some of our cultures, not all of our cultures, some of our cultures are impacted by ideas that are un-Islamic. The woman is not a slave to the in-laws in Islam. And in some cultures, that concept came in from outside of Islam, and it remained. So those are like 9 areas in which we find that couples overall, and I added the other 2, like I said, areas, how I feel in the relationship, and I gave an example, but that can go on and on. And the issue of in-laws and friends, I could have put friends in the 10th category, but I didn't. But those are issues overall as to why it is that we find that people have, in general, Muslim, non-Muslim, conflicts in their relationships. Let me just try to see if what's going on with the if there's any questions or anything that says. Okay, so the chapter that comes after this, we're not done with this chapter. We're just giving a general outline. But the chapter that comes after this, it deals with the issue of accepting and sharing opinions. That chapter, for us, now we come into a particular special idea that's very important, that is this a descriptive, is a sifa. يعني هذه صفة المؤمنين والمسلمين يعني صفة الشورى, consultation and istishara, taking opinions. Chapter 3 will deal with the issue, right? Because that's important with regard to how it is that we deal with conflict, how it is that we're dealing with these issues. How do we deal with money? How do we organize our time, or talk about how we have time with each other? How do we deal with the responsibilities of the household? How do we deal with the children? How do we deal with priorities? How do we deal with intimacy? How do we resolve the conflicts of the past? How do we deal with in-laws and friends? How I feel in the relationship. You see what I'm saying? So the book is called Healthy Relationships by Rachel Chapman, but I'm adding my own, commentary to it, trying to contextualize it so that it works for our community. But the subtitle is Overcome Anxiety, Couple Conflicts, Insecurity, and Depression Without Therapy. That doesn't mean some of us don't need therapy. But, here's just beginning, because what we want to do with this program is that this is actually part of an overall program which is dealing with the family. And so what we wanted to do was outline some things that are usually not talked about in our community with regard to relationships, so that our community itself, specifically here in North Hudson, Islamic Educational Center, Union City, North Jersey, East Coast, and so for our youth to be able to be prepared for marriage. But overall, so the general community, we begin to look at these things in a different way, right? So yes, there's times where people need therapy, but we also need to understand human psychology at a better level, right? Stop jealousy and negative thinking. Learn how to have a happy relationship with anyone, right? But really, a lot of this is focused. We're focusing it on husband-wife relationship, but some of this stuff can help us with other people as well. I hope that clarifies for you. So we need understanding, we need communication, we need empathy. Those things have to be in place in order for us to be able to deal with our issues. The first thing that we talked about was the issue of active listening. If there's no active listening, that's in the first session. For those of you who didn't deal with that or didn't listen to that, didn't reflect upon that, go back, because active listening is a form of communication, but a specific form of communication. Without active listening, we're not going to be able to resolve conflicts. How are we going to resolve conflicts, and how are we going to deal with arguments if we're not even listening to each other? I'm sorry, people, but at that point in time, you wrote the death of your relationship. It may last for a certain period of time, but in today's time where everybody's aiming at their own happiness and individual, you're writing the death of your relationship if you don't invest the time to listen, not talk. Listen to the other person. So the author says, there was those things that lead in general to fights and marriages overall across cultures, religions. But there's also good fights. She says that there's 4 good fights. And I'll leave I'll pause here for the minute. No, hold on. I'll do it this way. There's fights that are good to reset the boundaries in the relationship so the other person knows the limits and you know the limits for the other person. That help us to recommit. That's another part, second type of fight. To help us to recommit. But that if we're going to recommit to the relationship, we have to know that there's goals and there's a certain character that I should bring. Each person at this point has to focus on what you are responsible for. Don't tell me about what he's responsible for or what she's responsible for. Each person there has to say, I commit. We have this fight. It clarifies certain things for us. I commit. I recommit to this relationship. And I added the whole issue of goals and character. In other words, no one, this idea of that, we get married and everything is as it's supposed to be, that's a problem. No, relationships are like farming. What you put into the dirt is what you start to reap. If you don't take care of the crops, if you don't, in the time of hardship, when there's drought, if you don't figure out how to get water to those crops, if you don't protect those crops from the animals, if you don't protect those crops from thieves, if you don't protect those crops from weeds and everything that comes into there or insects, then your crop will die. Relationships are like farming. You can't expect that you're going to get what you want out of the relationship as far as goodness and peace and everything else is concerned without putting in the work. That's not logical. Another type of good fight is you learn something for the relationship, for you, about the other person. Yes, sometimes conflict is the only way that things, are clarified, but it's not just any type of conflict. We can't destroy each other. And it's okay. Sometimes we have to express ourselves and we have to affirm ourselves, but we have to give that space that's allowable to do. Give each other the space where if I want to express myself, as long as I'm not attacking you or trying to destroy your dignity or cursing you out, I may raise my voice. I may say communicate a particular set of feelings or ideas or whatever it may be. But I should do it in a way with that goal to be understood, not to attack the human being that's my spouse. Because that's still a human being. It's not a rock. That human being has feelings. So your words can be destructive. Or you may bring up something from the past, that may be something that you're reminding that person of an issue that they have, or a problem that they went through, or a mistake that they made. the goal there. So good fights is where we learn something. I may learn that I'm weak. I may learn that I fight because I haven't learned how to express myself. I fight because in my family, that's how we did things. And I just became aware of, wow, I sound just like my mother. I sound just like my father. I didn't pay attention to that before. So there's good fights. So then the last one of the 4 good fights, she says makeup. She said makeup sex. Fighting that leads to makeup sex. I personally don't agree with that 100%. But that's there, fine. Why? Because we don't want people to think that physical intimacy and the feel good of physical intimacy is going to resolve their situations in their marriage. If you're not dealing with what is underlying on the emotional level and what's there at the spiritual level, you can't be in a situation where one of the spouses is going out and getting drunk and coming back home. This is a real case. And the other person is thinking about Dean and how we educate the community and how we function. That's not in our community here. So I don't want to say that so people can get confused. No, it's in far off place. You don't know who it is. But we can't expect that that's just going to be, a situation where things are okay. So makeup sex, like she says, is not going to resolve that. That's a problem in the relationship. You see what I'm saying? Those are deeper issues. So we need to get out of our minds that physical intimacy is going to resolve everything in a relationship. We're more than just instinctual gratification and pleasure. In other words, we need more in life than that. That has its role, it has its place. But this society has obsessed with that to a point that is problematic. The book Love and Will by Rollo May, it was written in, I believe, in the 60s or the 50s, I believe. It was written in the 50s. He's a psychologist and existential psychologist, and he chronicles the change that has taken place in the understanding of sex in this society that we live in, and how it has transformed it to something which hasn't been understood. And so the danger that we have sometimes when we read psychology books and we do counseling theory and all of that is that we are accepting these ideas that come in. We as Muslims, we have a certain understanding of ourselves. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was very intimate with Aisha. Look at, they ran together. We have to sometimes have an understanding that just being in each other's presence is equal or more important than physical intimacy. That has its role. I'm not downplaying its role in a marriage. Praying together. You're not going to hear that in the counseling session at times unless that counseling session allows Iman to come into that reality. You're not going to find that in a YouTube help video, right, that is not considering what it means to be Muslim in a relationship. We can't underestimate the reality of praying together. So I want to go back to that point. So then, good fights should lead us to intimacy, spiritual intimacy, emotional intimacy, intellectual intimacy, meaning that we understand each other. The issue of physical intimacy is nice and all that, but it's not, and it's important for couples, especially if there's a deficiency in that, but that's not going to overall, make things better. We have to not be blind in that regard. So the book is laid out, at least this chapter, why the fight takes place in general in marriages. And we talked about 9 points, that there's good fights, and it talks about that there's bad fights. I'm going to put a little more time into this, about 10 more minutes or so, and just talk about the solutions in some of those areas that were mentioned, and then we have to cut it short, and we have to make it we have to break this section up into a couple of different talks. But there's so much material, and actually this is exactly what a lot of people are lacking, this type of being able to identify my relationship is on the rocks, and why are we fighting in this conflict, and how do we work through this? So this is at least a basic introduction to this point, or a primer, or whatever you can say in that regard, some initial principles. So one of the things that she says fighting about money is very common. Some fights are on how spending takes place, or should we invest the money that we have in the bank, or should we go on vacation, or who controls the finances. Or one person may be mutahafiz, I don't like to spend much, and the other person may be they may base their financial decisions on the spur of the moment. You know what I'm saying? Like, right? Oh my God, I just saw this TV and I just need to get it right now. And the other person may consider it careless. So, or there may be a fight, over not talking to each other about what's spent or what's the priority. You want to go on a vacation, but we can't pay the mortgage. So the solution, she says, take a deep breath, sit down and talk about it. And if there's no communication, if there's no listening, people, we can't talk about it. So all of these issues are going to come back at this point, at least at the foundational level, to being able to communicate with each other. And then the issue of agreement, or how to resolve the issue, is another point. But how can we take a deep breath and sit down and talk about it if we don't even listen to each other? So take out a few hours from the weekend, she says, and discuss the issue of finances and how it's going to be worked out. Because in this society, the whole of the relationship, its existence, the home, the shelter, the food, everything that comes along with that, working, is going to come back down to finances. If one person wants to go to school, the other person doesn't, or both want to go to school, the finances behind that. So take out time to discuss those issues, what needs to be done, especially the younger couples. And later on in life, you may need to do that, especially those who are thinking about marriage. In other words, you may have done that in the beginning and then you no longer do that anymore. Right. And so write down all the expenses, be clear and transparent, that are made in a month, in a week, and start setting a budget, and then make it something that you agree to and you implement. And that was the issue where shorter comes in. And don't be so tight that, it becomes, if you have some money to spend. But, if you go overboard a little bit, it's okay. But you also have to think about a time of emergency and the time where you get older. As far as the kids are concerned, that's the point of fighting. The children, I like to say, better the kids. Because the word kids, actually in the English language, it means goats. And it kind of an offensive term. It became popular for children. But the word children is better. Again, you first need to sit down and ponder over this deeply. The kids are the ones that are most affected. This is not just like finances. This is not like just something between you and your spouse at the personal level. This affects lives, the children. So you love them and you want what's best for them. So you need to be clear on how you're going to raise them, deal with them, how you're going to impact them. And for all my couples that are very at a critical point in their relationship, and you don't know if you're coming or you're going, and you don't know if a divorce is going to come about, don't make the children casualties of war, right? Don't do that. The children are human beings. They're an amana, a trust from Allah wa ta'ala. And the concept of amana means that they should be safe. So don't destroy them. Don't use them as pawns. يعني أنت ستحاسب على هذا. You're going to come to account before Allah wa ta'ala if you're playing with the children as pawns in the relationship. They don't deserve that. And you owe us that as a community to deal with that in the right way. Because you married as part of the community overall. And so when you damage your children, you put the burden on us. Now we have to figure out how to deal with those children. And the studies say that children that are going through divorce or have uh, experienced divorce or experiencing conflict in the relationship, that they begin to have emotional problems, psychological problems, and that makes them prone to drug addiction or drug use, or even exposing themselves in the wrong way to relationships. It begins when there's an abuse of the children, like I use the children as a pawn and I just walk out and just leave them. It makes our younger children, some of them suicidal. It makes our girls have daddy issues and all of that type of stuff, where they begin to fall for any attention that comes their way. That is a big issue of how we raise our children. And in this case, don't use the children, as pawns. So she says, overall, things should be mutually laid out as far as ground rules, so that you can be adults and sensible and responsible in how it is that you're dealing with the children as far as time is concerned. Instead of fighting over how you two want to spend 24 hours of the day, join forces and dedicate a time together on a regular basis. That doesn't mean that you're scheduled into my life, but that means that we give each other priorities. That doesn't mean you can't spend more time together. But the goal shouldn't be to prioritize one's interests over the others, but rather finding a middle ground in this regard. In other words, make sure that there's a time period where there's no cell phone, where there's no calls, where there's no work being done, where there's no TV. You understand what I'm saying? It's not just about food and this and that, because those things can be a distraction. At least give each other 10 minutes a day where it's completely, just about you and the other person. It's not about physical intimacy. It's about you and the other person just connecting. Most of the studies are saying that people are not even talking 5 minutes a day with real communication with each other. Parents and children and everybody, so on and so forth. At least that was what was said in the past. I imagine now it's worse because of the issue of social media and the issue of cell phones and everything else that comes along with that. As far as priorities, she gives us a concept of a solution. Priorities change over time. You need to understand that goals change. The relationship is reset. That's why communication is important. When you're 50 years old, it's not the same that when you were 20 years old or 30 years old in the relationship. The beginning of the relationship is not the same as the middle of the relationship. Middle of the relationship is not the same when you're aging and you're at that point where you may be facing death, like literally looking at death. It's not the same. So priorities change overall. You may have to work more. You know what I'm saying? So at the end of the day, instead of fighting over it, talk it out. And express what you missed from what worked before and how you can arrange things. And here she says, also make it a rule to limit the use of phones when home, so that you two can connect rather than connecting with everyone in the world. I'm going to say something about this issue of the lack of priorities. And I'll take one more point and I'll close off, because I said about 10 minutes. I think I went a little over. Not having priorities for each other to connect. Listen to me carefully. يعني هذا باب من أبواب الزنا. It's one of the entry points from the entry points that exist, or the paths, يعني طريقة من طرق الزنا. Why? Because when you are not in a relationship, which you're connecting with your spouse, you're going to be looking for how to deal with your human needs of attention and connectedness, and in some cases, physical intimacy somewhere. Some people may say, how can you say that? I'm just being real. I love you. That's why I'm telling you that. We have the concept of emotional cheating. We can talk about that, whether it's Islamic or not Islamic, but just to put it out there. So we have some people that they begin to go online and get attention online because they don't have a connectedness at home. We have other people that begin to look at another relationship, whether it's halal or haram, because the relationship at home is dysfunctional. at the level of connectedness. Let's be real. We're human beings. We're in a society where everything goes. The pressure of the society saying, nope, we're not going to allow that is not there. So people can hide, they can do what they want at the end of the day, but we need to be healthy, spiritually, mentally, and in our decisions, and we need to know what leads to our destruction. If we're not clear on that, then what begins to happen is that we are an accomplice, meaning that we are investing in our own destruction. So that doesn't work, so we have to know how to align our priorities. They don't have to be 100%, but we have to give each other the priority, right? And then the last one, when she talks about sex, and I said that the term intimacy is better. I'm gonna read this whole one for those of you who struggle with this. And she's just dealing with the issue of sex. I said personally, intimacy on multiple levels is better. We'll come back to that because we're going to end with this one. But this is something that people don't like to talk about and that. So I'll bring it to the table. She said there was a time when you just couldn't have enough of physical intimacy. What changed? Why are you no longer interested in it? Is there someone else? That's what the question comes up to me. Do you not feel attracted to me anymore? You see, now that whole issue, you don't feel attracted to me based on that issue. Now it's the issue of your self-worth. That's the problem. When we don't know how to deal with relationships, we begin to tear ourselves down. Why are you blaming yourself in that regard? Why can't you talk it out to understand? Why immediately go to that? You know what I'm saying? So be careful with that. Don't just consider yourself to be the problem in terms of your self-worth, or that the relationship is dead. That's not going to work. So here she says the lack of sex, physical intimacy, or less of it can trigger an argument or a fight among couples. Or I like better what she was talking about. You can begin to feel that there's something wrong, that you're no longer attractive, that there's an issue on another level, that your value is not the same. That to me is more important than just the triggering the argument. Because that's the underlying feelings where people begin to devalue themselves. And also, you shouldn't value your worth shouldn't be that your spouse wants to be with you 100% on that, because that's not where your worth is at. In Deen, Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala teaches us that al-karama, you have karama, you have dignity, you have value, you have honor just by you being created by Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Don't take that your value comes to you because of what goes on physically between you and your spouse. That's not a healthy way to approach that. Now, you could talk about the relationship having an issue, you know what I'm saying, because of that, but not your value. You understand what I'm saying? That's important. That you know your value regardless. Because see, some of these things, something may be wrong with you at work. You may be depressed. There may be a physical issue, ailment. There's 1,000 things that could be the case. You may be busy with the kids. As to why people don't have intimacy, does that mean you don't have value at that point? You may be the person that's giving to the relationship and holding it on. Your value is incalculable. As to what good that you're bringing to the relationship. No, we need to be clear where our value lies at. We need to be clear why there's problems in that area. You understand what I'm saying? But we should never take ourselves out. If the spouse is telling you negative things about yourself, that is not a correct way to deal with that. That's destroying the relationship at the core, right? That's destroying the relationship at the core. Here she says, the lack of sex or less of it can easily trigger an argument or fight among couples, since everyone has a difficult need. And, as far as what physical sexual intimacy is concerned, everybody's not at the same level. That's why we need to study physical development, because at different stage in the sociology of marriage, we learn that at different stages in life, the sexual energy is different. The needs are different, right? And so we need to be aware of those patterns. Young people need to understand that at the beginning of the relationship, that may be something that you're engaging, but when you have children, it may lessen. So the man needs to understand that the woman now is putting her energy into raising their children, and she's putting the energy into things like breastfeeding. The children may be in the bedroom with you. It distracts. It doesn't mean that you don't have value. You shouldn't be jealous of your children because you're the one that decided to have those children when you got married. You have to discuss what that means. That's why she wrote the issue of priority. You have to give each other priority. But young people, you need to understand that shifts the relationship. And there's a lot of things that come along with that, a lot of other issues that need to be discussed on that front. Since everyone has a different need for that, it changes. You may feel left out if your partner rarely initiates it. Perhaps they are too tired, they just want to go to bed. Perhaps there's so much going on in their heads that it's not just something that comes right now. Perhaps you were arguing, you treated each other like dirt and crap and garbage, and you humiliated each other, and it's not something that you're thinking about. Perhaps you're worried about your relative with cancer. Perhaps you're worried about your child that's no longer coming home. There's 1,000 reasons why fights lead. There are a dozen reasons why this issue can lead to fights, arguments, and even separation, and I add divorce. So the solution, thus, understand each other's needs and try to, work with your spouse. Also, instead of being quiet about your needs and wants, openly express your concerns and what's going on in that regard and how it's affecting your physical, mental, spiritual state. And with that, we end, and we ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to give us hidayah. And we ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to allow us to experience muwadda and rahmah in our relationships. And we ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to allow us to incline to each other. And we ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to remove those things which are obstacles for us to be truly intimate in the way that we were created to be intimate, physically, spiritually, emotionally, and in our growth overall. And we ask Allah Ta'ala to forgive us our sins. And I encourage people, if there was something that was problematic that you did in your relationship, which is a violation of your partner's rights or the rights of Allah, make tawbah. Make tawbah, because removing that from your relationship on the spiritual level and with yourself, keep making tawbah if it's an issue that you're struggling with, but that's important. And remember the first lesson, which is the issue of what? The issue of active listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.